to Deep Sleep Stories. If these stories have helped you through restless nights, please leave a review. Reviews are what help this podcast grow, reach more listeners, and stay alive. Without them, even something meaningful can slowly disappear. So if this show has brought you comfort, that small act truly helps keep it going. Now, settle in, and let's begin.
Settle in now and welcome to Deep Sleep Stories, where your only job is to rest as we drift together into a gentle tale about a single lingering raindrop that arrives at the very end of April. You can let your eyes soften as if they're growing heavier with every slow blink. Let your shoulders fall away from your ears. Let your jaw unclench, the tongue resting easily as though it has nowhere else to be. With a familiar weight, the kind that makes your body feel safely anchored. Somewhere nearby, the faint scent of rain lingers. Fresh soil, a hint of green, a whisper of stone that has been washed clean. Outside, the world is dim and gentle. The cloudy sky hangs like a soft quilt. The light is the color of pearl and milk, the kind that turns sharp edges into smooth shapes. The sound of water is there, but it's fading. An occasional drip, a last little patter, as if the rain is finishing a lullaby. Take a slow breath in and let it travel all the way down to where your ribs widen. Hold it softly for a moment and breathe out as if you're exhaling a long, quiet sigh. Again, breathing in calm, breathing out anything you no longer need. Each exhale loosens the day's knots. Each inhale brings a little more ease. And as you listen, you can picture this story as a distant lantern in a misty garden, glowing, steady, and not asking anything of you but to drift. Somewhere beyond your room, beyond the last drip from the eaves, beyond the softened horizon, April is taking its final breath. And in that breath, the last raindrop of the month is about to fall. In a valley where the hills curved like sleeping animals and the trees held their branches as patiently as open hands, there was a village that loved the rain. It wasn't a village that rushed. The roads were narrow, the stones worn smooth by time and footstep. Gardens spilled over their fences in generous little tides of herbs and blossoms. Window boxes brimmed with thyme and violets, and the roofs were gray slate that shone like river fish after a storm. The people there had grown used to listening. They listened to the wind's direction, to the birds' small arguments in the hedgerows, to the way the clouds stacked themselves. They listened too for rain, because rain in that valley didn't only water the earth, it carried messages. Old folks told stories about how the rain remembered everything it touched, how it could borrow the scent of pine, the sweetness of apple blossoms, the mineral hush of mountain stone, how it sometimes carried laughter from one side of the valley to the other, and how it sometimes carried quiet comfort when someone's heart was heavy. Whether the stories were true or only true in the way stories could be, no one argued much. The rain came, the rain went, and each time the valley felt gently remade at the edge of the village where the last house leaned into the field, like it wanted a better view of the meadow. There stood a cottage with a small greenhouse attached to its side. The greenhouse walls were made of old glass panes that shimmered faintly, patched with care, each piece catching the light differently. Inside that cottage lived a gardener named Linnea. Linnea was not old, but she carried the kind of calm that made her seem as if she had all the time in the world. She moved slowly through her days, not because she was tired, but because she liked to notice things. She liked to notice how a leaf turned toward the sun, how the soil darkened after a drink, how the air changed when rain was on its way. People came to Linnea for small cures and gentle comforts. A cup of mint tea for a restless stomach, lavender bundles for anxious nights, rosemary for remembrance when someone needed it most. Linnea never pretended she could fix everything, but she was good at helping people feel held. And every year when April was nearly finished, Linnea performed a quiet ritual all her own. She would set a shallow ceramic bowl outside on the windowsill, the bowl painted with pale blue swirls like little rivers. She would lay in it a few petals, whatever was first blooming that season, and she would wait. It was said in the old village tales that April always tried to leave behind a final blessing. Not a storm, not a downpour, but one single drop that contained the soft echo of all the rains that had fallen in that month. A drop that held the month's last sigh, the last cool touch, the last secret shimmer. Some people laughed at the idea. Some forgot. Some were too busy to care. But Linnea waited because she liked the thought that the world offered small gifts to those who were gentle enough to notice. And because, in her own way, she believed the valley had a heart and that the rain was one of its voices. That evening, the sky was a wide, pale bruise of cloud, and the rain had nearly ended. The last gusts of wind moved through the orchard with a tired softness. A few droplets still slid from leaves and fell into the grass, where they vanished without sound. Linnea stepped out onto her little porch with a lantern. The lantern's light was warm and honey-colored, and it made the wet stones gleam. She checked her bowl. A few raindrops had collected there already. The petals floated like tiny boats. Linnea leaned in close, as if listening for something. The water in the bowl was still, almost too still. "April," she murmured, her voice barely lifting above the hush. "If you have one last thing to say, I'm here." Then she smiled at herself, softly amused, as if she knew she was speaking to a month, to a sky, to air. She picked up the bowl with careful hands, brought it inside, and set it on the wooden table near her window. The cottage smelled of damp earth and herbs. Bundles of dried chamomile and sage hung from ceiling beams. The small fire in the hearth crackled gently, making the room feel like a warm pocket in the cool night. Linnea sat beside the table with her palms resting on her knees. She watched the bowl. She watched the tiny ripples settle. She watched the petals drift into a quiet arrangement, as if guided by invisible threads. Outside, the clouds thinned slightly. The rain became a memory. And then very softly, the air changed. It wasn't dramatic. It was more like a subtle shift in scent, as though the world had turned a page. The room felt a little clearer, a little more expectant. Linnea's eyes lifted to the window. There, on the glass clinging to the outside, was a single raindrop that had not fallen with the rest. It trembled faintly, catching the lantern's reflection. It looked almost luminous, as if it held a small star. The droplet did not hurry. It seemed to pause, and in its pause, the entire cottage felt as if it was holding its breath. Linnea remained very still, as though she didn't want to frighten it. She leaned forward a fraction. The raindrop quivered, then began to slide. Down the pane of glass, slow as honey, the droplet traveled. It left behind a thin, shining trail. When it reached the bottom edge, it hung there for a long moment, gathering itself. Then it let go. It fell, and it fell with a kind of tenderness. It landed in the bowl with the lightest touch, barely more than a kiss on the water's surface. A single perfect ring spread outward. The petals rocked gently. The water caught the lantern glow and turned it into a small, shifting gold. Linnea exhaled, her shoulders softening even more. "There you are," she whispered. For a moment, nothing else happened. The droplet seemed like any other drop now, lost in the collected rainwater. But as Linnea watched, the water in the bowl began to shimmer faintly, as if moonlight had slipped into it. The shimmer gathered at the center, where the last drop had entered. A delicate sound rose from it, not a voice, not quite, but a tone. A note that reminded Linnea of wind through reeds, or the quiet hum that sometimes filled the air just before dawn. The note deepened, softened, and changed into something almost like words. Not words that needed to be understood, but words that could be felt. Linnea felt them in her chest, like a hand resting there. A simple message formed inside her as naturally as a thought. Keep it safe. Carry it gently. Let it go where it needs to go. Linnea's gaze stayed on the bowl. Her mind drifted, not in confusion, but in a kind of dreamy clarity. She realized with a quiet certainty that this last raindrop was not meant to remain in her cottage. It was meant to travel, not far perhaps, but to a place that needed the soft blessing of April's end. Linnea rose slowly from her chair. The cottage creaked warmly around her, as if it approved. She went to a cabinet and took out a small glass vial. The vial was clear and smooth, with a cork that fitted snugly. Linnea used it for collecting tiny things: a seed from a rare flower, a pinch of glittering sand from the riverbank, a single bead someone had lost and later found again. She returned to the bowl and dipped the vial into the water. The petals slid aside as if making room. The water flowed in with surprising ease, and the shimmer gathered into the vial like a shy animal finding shelter. Linnea held the vial up to the lantern light. Inside, the water glowed faintly, and within it there seemed to be a tiny swirl, like a miniature cloud turning over itself. She placed the cork in gently. The moment it sealed, the glow steadied, becoming softer, like a sleepy firefly. Linnea tucked the vial into the pocket of her wool shawl, close to her heart. Outside, the village was quiet. A few windows still held lamplight, but most were dark. The wet cobblestones reflected the dim sky. Somewhere, an owl called once, then fell silent again. Linnea stepped out into the cool night air and pulled the shawl closer around her shoulders. Her boots made almost no sound on the damp ground. She moved not as someone sneaking, but as someone honoring the sleeping world. The path from her cottage led through the meadow. In daylight, the meadow was a tumble of green and wild flowers, buzzing with bees and dotted with butterflies. At night, it became something else entirely, a wide, breathing blanket of shadow and scent. Linnea walked slowly. She let the air fill her lungs and then leave again. The clouds above were thinning, revealing a faint scatter of stars, like pinpricks in a veil. As she crossed the meadow, she noticed how the rain had left everything freshly polished. Every blade of grass held beads of water. The world seemed to glitter quietly, not with brightness, but with a gentle kind of presence. Halfway across, Linnea paused. She wasn't sure why at first. It wasn't a sound that stopped her exactly. It was more like a feeling, like the sense of someone standing just behind you, not threatening, just there. Linnea turned her head. Near a patch of silver-leafed plants that shone faintly in the starlight, something moved. Small, quick. Linnea didn't startle. She waited. The meadow didn't feel dangerous. It felt curious. A tiny figure stepped into view. At first glance, it might have been mistaken for a moth because it had a pale shimmer around it. But it stood upright, no taller than Linnea's hand, and its shape was unmistakably person-like, slender, delicate, as if made from dew and moonlight woven together. Its hair, or what looked like hair, fell in fine strands that glimmered like spider silk. Its eyes were dark and wide, reflecting starlight. Around its shoulders was a cape that seemed like a folded petal, soft and translucent. Linnea took a slow breath in, and with it came a familiar memory. Old stories, told in the village when the fire was low. Stories about rainkin, small shy beings that lived in puddles and cloud edges that traveled on mist and hid beneath leaves. Most people said they were just stories. Linnea had always listened a little more carefully. The tiny figure held up a hand, palm outward, as if greeting her. Linnea lowered herself into a gentle crouch. "Hello," she whispered, not wanting to break the quiet. The rainkin's gaze slid to Linnea's shawl pocket. The faint glow within the vial pulsed once, as though it recognized something. The rainkin made a sound like a soft chime. Then, quite clearly, not in Linnea's ears, but in her mind, it conveyed a feeling of direction. Not words, but an image. A small hollow beneath an ancient tree, where the earth was thirsty in a way rain couldn't always reach. A place where roots twisted around a stone that held warmth, even in the cool spring. A place where something waited. Linnea nodded slowly. "You know where it needs to go," she murmured. The rainkin's cape fluttered, though there was no wind. It stepped closer, and Linnea noticed it left no footprint, no imprint in the wet grass. It seemed to float just above the world. Linnea rose and continued walking, but now she walked with a companion. The rainkin kept pace at her side, sometimes darting ahead, sometimes circling back, always staying within the soft reach of her lantern's glow. It moved like a thought, like a blink, like the shimmer of water when sunlight first touches it. They left the meadow and entered a small grove at the valley's edge. The grove was older than the village, and the trees there were thick-trunked, their bark furrowed with time. Moss-covered stones like velvet, ferns unfurled in quiet spirals. The air here was cooler, richer. It smelled of mushrooms and wet wood and the deep, dark sweetness of soil. Linnea's lantern light became smaller beneath the trees, swallowed by shadow. But the rainkin's faint shimmer helped, as if it carried a small piece of sky with it. They followed a narrow path that wasn't really a path at all, just a way of walking that the animals used. Linnea's boots stepped carefully over roots and around puddles. The forest was filled with tiny sounds, a drip from a leaf, the distant gurgle of a stream, the soft rustle of something small moving through undergrowth. Eventually they came to an enormous tree. It stood apart from the others like a quiet guardian. Its trunk was wide enough that Linnea could not have wrapped her arms around it. Its branches reached high, disappearing into the darkness above. At its base, the roots rose from the earth like waves frozen mid-surge. Nestled among those roots was a hollow. The hollow was not empty. In its center sat a stone, smooth and rounded, with a shallow depression at its top, as if it had been shaped by water over a very long time. The depression held a little bit of rainwater already, but not much. The earth around it looked dry beneath the surface, as if the rain had not been able to soak deeply there. The rainkin stepped forward and hovered above the stone, its hands outstretched as if it was warming them over an invisible fire. Linnea knelt slowly. The lantern rested on the moss beside her, casting a gentle circle of light that made the forest feel intimate and close. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the vial. The glow inside was steadier now, as if calm. Linnea held the vial above the stone's shallow depression and hesitated, not out of doubt, but out of reverence. This felt like placing a final note at the end of a song. She removed the cork. A scent rose instantly, rain on warm pavement, crushed green leaves, distant thunder softened by hills. It was the scent of April itself, with all its changeable moods and tender beginnings. Linnea tilted the vial. The water poured out slowly, smoothly. As if reluctant to leave, it formed a thin stream that caught the lantern light and turned it into a ribbon of gold. When the last of the water slipped into the stone's depression, the glow gathered there, swirling gently like a tiny galaxy. Then the forest seemed to exhale. The stone warmed beneath Linnea's fingers. The moss around it brightened slightly, not in color but in presence, as if it had become more awake. The roots of the tree seemed to settle, and a deep, almost inaudible hum filled the air. It wasn't loud, it wasn't startling, it was soothing, like the sound your own body makes when it is finally safe enough to rest. Linnea watched as the water in the stone's depression sank, not evaporating, not spilling, but being welcomed into the earth. As it disappeared, the soil around the roots darkened, drinking it in. The tree's bark seemed to glisten, and somewhere above, a single leaf unfurled with a soft, secret motion. The rainkin lowered its hands and turned toward Linnea. In its dark eyes, the lantern light danced. A feeling came to Linnea again, gentle as a lullaby. Gratitude, yes, and also completion. April had finished its journey here. Linnea's own chest loosened, as if she had been holding something she hadn't even realized she carried. Not worry, exactly. More like the tension of moving from one season to another, from one chapter to the next. She realized in that quiet moment that she'd been sensing the shift in the air for days. April's restless softness had been winding down, and May's slow warmth was waiting just beyond the horizon. The rainkin lifted a hand and touched the air, as though it was smoothing a wrinkle in the world. Then it stepped backward. Its edges began to blur, not like something vanishing in fear, but like something returning to where it belonged. The shimmer around it grew faint, like a candle turned low. Linnea stayed still. She didn't reach out to stop it. She had the sense that this was not goodbye, but a gentle dissolving into the forest itself. The rainkin's form became mist, and the mist became nothing more than a coolness in the air, a freshness that lingered, a final glimmer, and then only moss and shadow remained. Linnea sat back on her heels and rested a hand on the tree's root. She felt its steady patience, its quiet strength, the way it had stood through so many Aprils, receiving their rains, holding their stories in its rings. She listened. The forest's hum softened, but it did not disappear. It became part of the background, like the sound of blood moving through a body, like breath in a sleeping room. Linnea stood slowly and picked up her lantern. Its light seemed warmer now, as if the night had grown kinder. She began the walk home. The path back through the grove felt smoother, though it was the same path. The puddles reflected a little more starlight. The air smelled less like rain and more like new leaves. Somewhere, a stream sang softly to itself, as if pleased. When Linnea reached the meadow again, the sky had cleared further. Stars scattered overhead, bright enough to make the world feel wide and gentle. The grass held fewer droplets now, as though the night was drying the earth with careful hands. Linnea walked as if she was moving through a dream. Her thoughts were slow, unhooked from urgency. Each step was quiet, each breath was easy. In the village, everything slept. The windows were dark, the gardens were still. The cobblestones held the coolness of the earlier rain, but they were no longer slick. Linnea reached her cottage and stepped inside. The fire in the hearth had dwindled to embers, glowing softly like a sleepy eye. The room smelled faintly of herbs and wood smoke. She set the lantern down and removed her shawl. Her pocket was empty now, but her chest felt full in a calm, peaceful way, as if she'd carried something important and set it down in the right place. Linnea went to the window and looked out. The sky was clear enough now that she could see the outline of the hills. A faint mist hovered near the ground, thin as breath. The world looked freshly washed, quietly renewed. On the windowsill outside, a tiny bead of water clung to the edge of the slate roof, one last leftover from the storm. It trembled, then finally fell into the darkness below. Linnea smiled, the kind of smile you might give a sleeping child. "Good night, April," she whispered. Then she turned away from the window and moved through her bedtime routine with gentle simplicity. She banked the embers. She tidied a cup. She brushed her hair with slow strokes. Each small motion seemed to tell her body it was safe to rest now. When she slipped into bed, the blanket rose to meet her like a familiar wave. She lay on her side, one hand tucked beneath her cheek, the other resting loosely on the mattress. Outside, the night held steady. No more rain came, no thunder, no sudden wind, only the quiet after. Linnea's breathing slowed, her eyelids grew heavy. The images of the grove and the ancient tree drifted through her mind like soft lantern light. Somewhere beneath the roots of that tree, April's last raindrop had become part of the earth. It was moving slowly through dark soil and hidden channels. It was reaching places rain couldn't easily reach on the surface. It was offering its gentle blessing to seeds and roots, to sleeping insects, to the quiet, waiting life below. And above ground, the valley was settling into a new chapter, one that would unfold in tender warmth. Now, as the story begins to soften and fade, the world can become quieter in your mind too. Imagine the last raindrop of April resting safely in the earth, no longer falling, no longer moving quickly, just blending into calm. Imagine the air after rain, that clean, peaceful feeling, the way it wraps around you like a cool, kind cloth. Your breathing can slow even more, in and out, a little gentler, a little deeper. The edges of the story blur like mist in the meadow. The cottage light dims, the grove grows still. The ancient tree stands quietly in the dark, untroubled, patient, holding the forest's heartbeat in its roots. Thoughts can drift by without catching. Sounds can soften. Your body can grow heavier, sinking down into comfort. There is nothing to solve, nothing to do, only rest. And if your mind wanders, it can wander like a small leaf on a slow stream, eventually settling again into quiet water. The last raindrop has fallen. April has said its final gentle word. The valley is safe. The night is kind. Good night, dear traveler. Sleep well.